Welcome to Boom, where we have biomechanics on our minds.
Boom.
Boom.
Boom. Boom. Boom.
Boom.
Boom.
All right, today we are really excited to be talking with Professor Ashely Weaver. Ashely is a professor of biomedical engineering at the Wake Forest School of Medicine. I actually had the opportunity to meet Ashely during my REU with the Center for Injury Biomechanics at Wake Forest, and I know that I wouldn't be here without you and without that program. So I'm really excited to share your work. We've had requests to have more computational work on the podcast, so we're excited to learn more about your experiences and the opportunities you're creating for undergraduate and graduate students. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be on, and it's good to see you again, Melissa, and to meet you, Hannah.
Yeah, it's so great to meet you. And part of meeting you and part of meeting Boom is getting to know you a little bit more and getting to know where, it all began. So our first question is, when did you first know that you wanted to be a biomechanist?
Yeah, I think I knew in undergrad. I went to undergrad at NC State and did biomedical engineering research, or majored in biomedical engineering. And, I had a biomechanics professor. His name was Peter Minty, but he was much more of a mentor than a mentee. Like, he was really fantastic. Like, one of those teachers that you just could tell it was palpable how much he cared about teaching and like making sure students learned. And I took a biomechanics course with him, and something just sort of clicked. Like, I knew that was like what I was interested in, sort of the direction that I wanted to take my biomedical engineering career. And that motivated me to then, look for biomechanics focused internships. It led me to apply for summer internships and eventually kind of set me on the path towards grad school and eventually like staying in academia as a faculty member. I would trace it all back to, that person that sort of sparked that initial interest in biomechanics for me.
That's amazing. And I feel like now you're kind of paying it forward and doing the same for other students, which is always really beautiful to see.
Yeah, that's the hope.
Many recommendations from students about you, so we're so excited to have you.
Yeah. Oh, that's nice to hear.
So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the current projects going on in your lab?
Sure. Yeah, I have a lot of variety in the things that I do. I'd say it all falls under kind of the umbrella of injury biomechanics, but I work in a lot of different application areas. And so I can tell you about sort of the three themes in the work that I do. The first one is more automotive, and that's really what I started out in injury biomechanics doing, was more automotive trauma research. We're part of a center called the Crash Injury Research and Engineering Network, SIREN. And it's actually the project that I worked on as a summer student was a SIREN project. And so it sort of interested me in the field.
Full circle. Yeah.
Yeah. And so 15 years later, the research is still going. But SIREN is a network of multiple centers across the U.S. that enroll seriously injured motor vehicle crash occupants, and we study how people get injured. And it's geared towards people that are driving more modern vehicles, like 7 years or newer. And so the goal is to sort of understand like why serious injuries are still happening when people are driving the vehicles that have the latest safety technology. And it's a really neat study. I always think of it as like CSI, but instead of crime scene. Yeah, instead of crime scene investigation, though, it's crash scene investigation.
Oh, okay. I like
it is
that.
CSI.
Yeah. But it's very much like that. It's kind of forensic in nature. We have a crash investigator that goes out and he collects evidence from the scene, and he goes to the impound lot and he takes all these pictures of the vehicle and measurements, and he looks for blood marks and scuff marks and hair and tries to figure out like where the person hit in the vehicle, like where'd their head hit, did it hit the roof side rail or the A-pillar, did they load the belt, were they belted, did the airbag deploy? So he collects all this like crash evidence, and then we have all the medical records and the radiology on the person, and we as engineers, along with the physicians that treated some of these patients, sort of get together and put the pieces of the puzzle together and try and figure out what the mechanisms of the injuries were and what the cause of the injuries were. And all this Yeah, all this data gets entered into a database and you can do research with it. And so my group has done a lot of papers on different like epidemiology of injury studies, or we've analyzed the medical imaging from these patients to sort of link the injuries on the imaging to, the crash characteristics, or we've done finite element modeling reconstructions of crashes to sort of simulate virtually what the crash looks like.
Interesting. And is this helpful for the doctors who are treating the patient and trying to figure out the mechanisms of their injury? Is it more from a legal standpoint? Is it designing cars better in the future? Where do you go after these types of analyses?
Yeah, so the study sponsored by the Department of Transportation, I think their interest in it is like to try to understand like what vehicle safety advancements still need to be made to protect people better in crashes. And so while we're not like sort of directly designing the like new safety technology for vehicles, I feel like the data that we collect informs that and leads to those things. So, some of the early data that like Siren collected, 10 or 15 years ago did point to like the need for, say, side airbags. I mean, that they're just in not just Siren, but like other data sets and stuff sort of pointed to this too. But that's the type of thing, like, I think that sort of motivates automakers and motivates the field to move forward, is collecting the data and sort of seeing what injuries are still happening.
Yeah. I worked at crash test safety at Toyota. And I just, whenever I think about it, I just think of, well, we got to watch the crash test, which was cool, but I also think about the pedestrian tests where they basically like straight up shot like a dummy head, like a cannonball style at the front of a car. And it's just like, I don't know, kind of traumatic, I think, to like think of this
Kind
again.
of.
But anyway, but it's really interesting to hear all these different pieces that are part of it, and the role that you play as a biomechanist in that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first sort of theme. What's the second theme of your research?
Yeah, the second theme is more osteoporosis and fracture prediction. So, I got my start kind of in the trauma field, but I was always interested in orthopedics, and I felt like there was more potential to sort of make a big public health impact with that research, because there's so many individuals, that are affected by osteoporosis, and fractures are a big concern. If someone is older and they get a hip fracture, there's like a 20% risk of death in the next year following that hip fracture. And so I was interested in like ways that we could use sort of our computational tools, our medical imaging and finite element modeling to better predict which people are at risk for fracture and try to diagnose that earlier so that you could maybe intervene and prevent the fracture from happening in the first place. And so I'm working on a couple projects that use like subject specific CT finite element modeling. So taking CT scans of participants and making finite element models of their bones, and then predicting what the breaking strength of that bone is in like a virtual simulation. And we're doing a lot of that work in clinical trials. So we will enroll people in like weight loss trials, and weight loss is actually really controversial in older age because not only do people lose fat, which is good, but they lose bone and they lose muscle when they lose weight. And so we're testing out different interventions so that older adults can lose weight more safely, like without losing bone.
Wow.
And using these modeling tools to predict and kind of assess the effectiveness of the intervention at different time points, before the intervention and like 6 months after and like 18 months after the intervention. And we're testing different interventions. So it's like one of the projects is looking at a higher protein diet versus a lower protein diet. And our hypothesis is that like the higher protein diet will preserve more of the bone and the muscle and, be a safer way to lose weight. And then we have another trial where we're testing resistance training, which we know resistance training is good for bones. And we're testing that against a weighted vest, which is this vest that the person wears, and we add weight back to the vest as they lose body weight, and they wear it for like 6 to 8 hours a day
to maintain load.
Yeah, you're replacing their body weight. But for an older adult, the idea is that may be easier for older adults to do because they don't have to go to a gym. They don't have to do this like scary resistance training that is intimidating for some older adults, and like may is at risk of injuring them, or they might be scared, if they do the wrong thing, that they could injure themselves. So if we can find that like this weighted vest is as effective as resistance training, it may be a more translatable intervention to prescribe.
You have to pair with Martha Hall, who does fashion and biomechanics.
I know, she
so
could
then,
make
so then people want to wear it even more because I actually enjoy wearing it.
Yeah, it's not
cool grandmas.
Yeah, it's not a very fashionable vest, so yeah,
not yet.
Yeah, you'd add some glitter or some sparkles to it or something.
Oh yeah, that's exactly what the bones need. Wow, that's awesome to see. Such great translation too of the work that you're doing, that's actually affecting people and helping them to be stronger and healthier and better. And especially at that time point where I feel like I have a soft spot for elderly people, and just like I worked a lot with people with Parkinson's in my PhD, and just I feel like I always wish there's more, there was more we could offer them and give them to help them.
Yeah, Parkinson's is actually like a condition too that's associated with a lot of osteoporosis, like early onset osteoporosis.
That makes sense.
Well, we're interested. Those were two like incredible research themes that you're working on, and we also know that you're interested and involved in some research regarding astronauts' physiological changes, which we have a class on human biomechanics here, and I remember there's a muscle adaptation lecture that talks about time and space and the muscle atrophy that can happen during that time, but also it can happen in as little as like 2 weeks of bed rest. So it's applicable to a wide number of populations,
which is crazy.
Not just astronauts. Yeah.
And so sad. I feel like sometimes I find it so I don't like to think about it. Like when I need a break or I injure myself, I'm like, oh, my muscles are just so quickly atrophying.
Spend 8 hours sitting in a chair and you're like, oh, what did I do today? But yeah, we're interested to kind of hear how you got into this niche, but really important and impactful field that.
Is this the third theme also? I don't
It is, yeah. Yeah, you're not missing anything. So I got into the spaceflight field as a kind of early career faculty member, and there was a proposal call that came out from NASA, and I remember like just thinking like, there's no way I'll get it. Like, I'm sort of a newbie in the NASA research and stuff. And like, I was in the first year of my faculty position, and I was talking to somebody about it, and they were like, well, you won't get it if you don't ever apply. And so like, yeah, that's you're right.
true.
If you don't buy a ticket to the lottery, you're not going to win the lottery. So I applied, and I think it was sort of the perfect study for like the training that I had done in like medical image analysis and finite element modeling to sort of take those tools and put them into solving a spaceflight problem. So this call was for proposals, was interested in, they were asking for tools or like a study to enroll astronauts and measure bone and muscle loss in their spine to better understand vertebral injury risk with spaceflight. And so the proposal that I submitted was to do, and this is the study that we're doing now, was to scan astronauts with CT and MRI pre and post flight before they go up to the space station for 6 months or more. And we scan them with MRI because that's good for measuring muscle, and we scan them with CT because that's good for measuring like bone mineral density. And then sort of the second aim of the study is to take what we measure and analyze from the medical images and map it to finite element models to make like astronaut specific versions of their anatomy.
That is so cool.
Yeah, pre-flight versions and post-flight versions. And then we put them, and we're using full human body models for this so that we can sort of tune the whole spine and all the musculature that supports it. And we can simulate then like landing events that are representative of what they might see when they're landing back on Earth, and predict what the risk of injury and how that changes, with different levels of muscle and bone deconditioning that they experience with space flight.
Is that when they are at the most risk? I guess I didn't even think about that. I was thinking more like if they come back and then want to be involved in sports again or something, like might have stress fractures or something like that. But it's the landing that they are at a risk for injury there too?
They're at risk for injury actually in both.
Mhm.
I work a lot with the occupant protection group at NASA, and their big risk that like NASA works in like risks. They map everything out in risk,
Mhm.
and they're trying to work towards sort of minimizing those risks. But dynamic loads is sort of their big risk area, and so they're trying to minimize like the risk of injury from these big dynamic loads that occur during landing. And there are injuries that can happen during the landing event. But you're right, Melissa, that there are also injuries that happen in sort of the rehabilitation phase, like as they're in the weeks like following after they come back, as they're learning to like walk and rehabilitate their muscles again. I've heard of a lot of like disc herniation and kind of back type injuries that, we're not really studying that in this study. Like we're sort of focusing on the landing event, not the rehab phase of it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that too, though, because like I guess I think more about the bones in the legs, or for some reason I don't know
That's
why.
why I was
Maybe it's because
like
I get
to
a lot of
save,
stress injuries, like shin splints, that sort of thing. But in your study, you recently published an article that was actually on trunk muscle atrophy, and so there's also this risk that you're saying of herniating discs and the muscles in the trunk, which I just didn't. It wasn't the first thing that came to my mind, I think, when I think of
Right.
muscles atrophying. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And also, I'm kind of curious, how you do model these different muscles of the trunk, and what kind of changes are you seeing in when someone spends 4 months at the ISS?
Yeah, this was a study that we did. We actually went back into some of the archive data that NASA had from prior space missions, as we were sort of waiting for our subjects to get enrolled and like spend their time up on the space station and come back down. We said we're going to go back and like analyze some of the archive data. And so this was data from the era of spaceflight. It was like the early 2000s or so. And we had 16 crew members that had gotten CT scans, and they had been scanned for a bone related study by another investigator. But in my work, like sort of working in the aging field, I was familiar with sarcopenia and like how it's assessed. And it's often assessed as more of like a whole body muscle measure, or on CT, they'll measure like the ring of muscle around the trunk, or like your core muscles around your abdomen. And we just thought, well, we could look at that in the astronauts and see like, trunk muscle changes. Because I don't think anybody's looked at that with CT and in space flight specifically. And so we calculated the trunk muscle area, which is like the ring of muscle around your abdomen. And we also calculated a skeletal muscle index, which has some sarcopenia thresholds. So we could sort of see where the astronauts fell in the sarcopenia range. And I should say that like sarcopenia is a term that's kind of like the analog to osteoporosis, but it's for muscle. So it's like low muscle mass is termed sarcopenia. And what we saw was about 5% losses on average in this trunk muscle area and the skeletal muscle index with the first 6 months of spaceflight. And the interesting thing is that like the kind of correlates, or the analog to that, if you think about like terrestrial aging, that 5% loss is about a decade of aging here on Earth.
Wow.
So it's much more rapid, loss of this muscle tissue than you would normally see in the aging process.
And that's with training? Like they're training and, trying to do load-bearing things up in space?
That was not with as much of the training that they're doing now. So again, this was like early 2000s.
I guess, yeah.
I don't think they had the treadmill up there, and they definitely did not have the advanced resistive exercise device. I think they might have had a like kind of interim device that did some resistance training, but what they've got up there now is much, much better, I think. And we're not expecting to see like as dramatic of muscle loss in like our data set that's where the astronauts are exercising with ARAD.
And even on Earth now, I feel like core is such a paid more attention to now, training those core muscles, because knowing that those muscles have a dramatic effect on the functioning of your entire body and other injuries. So
but it's just such a unique environment to study, because like you never think of injury, like injury is usually so focused on like a repeated motion or to one part of the body, but like this, like gravity affects the entire body equally, right? So
Yeah, it's a global problem. And, I think the reality is too, like even the resistive exercise devices, like there's some muscle groups they probably target really well and like other ones that are tough to target. And those are probably the muscles that we're going to see the bigger losses in, are the ones that aren't as, targeted with the resistive exercise device.
We just have to figure out how to turn gravity on up there periodically.
Yeah. We're going to need that when we go to Mars for sure.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Not if, when, yeah.
Yeah.
Are you I hope that you'll be involved in that research.
I hope so too. Those missions will be, really a feat, because the missions are close to 3 years long to get to Mars and back, and so you can imagine like just the physiological hurdles that have to be overcome to make that possible. Not just to the musculoskeletal system, but there's radiation and cardiovascular effects, and spaceflight affects every part of the body.
Yeah. Well, definitely they'll need a lot of different teams of researchers working together on that, I'm sure. Do you do that in your work currently? Work with other types of disciplines like that, like understanding not just the musculoskeletal system, but like you're saying, cardiorespiratory, and how they're influencing each other?
Yeah, I work more closely with the occupant protection group at NASA. I've had some interactions with like the suit and the anthropometry lab there, which they're working a lot with, like they're concerned about injury from landing, but they're also concerned about like EVA activities and those kinds of things. And we're doing some work with like lunar missions, which like
cool.
Yeah, the predicting injury risk with those, but the problems are different, because you're landing in like 1.6G gravity, and the environment's different than landing back on Earth. So I'm working a little bit, with different disciplines on that front, but yeah, I'm not really working with the cardiovascular groups or other groups there, like looking at other body systems. I just like have seen sort of presentations at conferences. There's a big NASA conference that happens every January or February, and you see a lot of research in those areas.
Yeah. Wow. It's so fun. It just like you talking about this and like thinking about modeling these systems and integrating with all these different groups makes me think of in our dynamics class, like, everything is set on Earth and like you learn how to do everything in like a Newtonian reference frame. But yeah, that doesn't necessarily apply. So how do you deal with like handling all these different, I don't know, like rules and unknowns and things like that?
Yeah, we make the best assumptions we can. Validate our models to the extent that we can. So I have one student that's had a couple years of a NASA fellowship now to model lunar landing events, which are in 1.6G gravity. They think the lunar lander may be piloted in a standing posture like the Apollo missions were. And so he's working with actually a pedestrian human body model. Melissa, when you mentioned pedestrian.
Yes. Okay, you're feeling triggered.
Yeah,
okay.
It's going to be okay.
Yeah. So it's a standing version of, we work a lot with the Global Human Body Models Consortium model, GHBMC. And there's a standing version of that that's a pedestrian model, but you can use it for non-pedestrian impacts, like just piloting a lunar lander on the moon, and so we've done some validation of that model in like spaceflight relevant environments. We've implemented active musculature now into that model so that we can better represent like the muscle activation as the person's like standing up, and there isn't like this abnormal slouching and stuff that occurs.
Wow.
What
does that mean to implement active musculature? And this is in the finite element model, right?
Yeah.
So it's like dynamic in changing the properties of the muscle throughout the simulation?
Yeah, the active musculature, it's beam elements like that. It's sort of like if like what an open sim model is.
Yeah.
It's sort of like putting the open sim like beam hill type muscle models into a finite element model.
Wow.
And there's hundreds of these like muscles that he's implemented into this model, but the muscle activation piece means that you can tune the like area, PCSA area of the muscle, which tells you like how much the muscle would contract, and you can also tune the response time of the muscle based off like neural delay. But the idea is that it, is supposed to, if you've got all the tuning correct and stuff, it should represent sort of the standing activation musculature. And the way that muscles are defined is a lot of them use like angle measurements. So like if you want to maintain a certain knee angle, like you can prescribe that into the model and tell it like, I want the knee to remain this angle, and the muscles sort of contract and activate to maintain that knee angle in the course of the simulation.
Okay. That's really interesting. Do you combine the finite element models with rigid body models? I'm curious too if when you're validating the models, is it with experiments that you're conducting, or do you do a lot of like literature searches, or kind of the details behind those models?
Yeah, we use data that's out there in the literature if it's available. For this lunar stuff, we actually worked with NASA to get some test data that they had done. They have this Argos system there, and it's like a rig that offloads the body so that they can kind of simulate 1/6 gravity. It's like a harness system that sort of lifts 5/6 of the weight off the person. And so they had done some testing there, suited testing with a volunteer. And so we have some of that data it's like a step off or jump off test. Like they're on a little platform, not very high, but the person sort of jumps or kind of steps off the platform and lands onto a force plate. And so we could look at like how well the forces in our model match the forces in that test. And there's also Vicon markers on the data that we could match it up with. And we had NASA also, like in this latest round of Argos testing that they did an unsuited test for us so that we could, also sort of validate the model against unsuited, because the previous one was they had put these markers on the spacesuit, but obviously the spacesuit and the body, move with each other, but they're not, completely coupled. So we wanted to have both sets of data to validate against.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm curious with so this research looking at different exercises or resistance training, and then you also talked about diets, kind of with the theme around bone health. Have they influenced any of your exercise or exercise routines or diets or anything that you've tried to implement in your life to support your bone health?
Yeah, I will say that I like do a little bit more resistance training now than I used to. I don't do as much of it as I wish I should, as I probably should. But I'm always been more of a runner. Like I like to run, but I think the cross training and supplementing that with resistance training is good. And I'm in the demographic too that's like going to be prone to get osteoporosis. I mean, years down the line, I hope not, not right away, but female, white Caucasian are like at most risk for developing osteoporosis later in life. And age 25 to sort of 30 or so is when your bone density peaks. So, it's good to, I think, like achieve the top peak that you can get, because it's going to go down from there.
It's amazing the kind of things that like happen around that. I also heard that our personalities like kind of don't change after our early 30s too. So our like physical and also,
a lot of things
or peaking soon. We talked a little bit how I was part of this program at Wake Forest, and you direct the Virginia Tech Wake Forest University School of Biomedical Engineering and Sciences graduate program, as well as the Wake Forest School of Medicine Biomedical Engineering research experience for undergrads. And we're seeing that this summer you're advising 2 different projects in the summer research experience for undergrads program. And we were wondering if you could share a little bit more about what it's like to work in these or direct these programs, and also what it's like to work with different undergraduate students who are not just at Wake Forest, but coming in from different universities, what that experience is like.
Yeah. So I'd say like this is where my passion really is. I really enjoy like being like director of these things, but also like working directly with the students and sort of training them, and I don't know, kind of giving back, because it was such an instrumental experience for me, like to do a summer internship and really figure out what I wanted to do with my life. So I really like to work with students, and whether that's them deciding like that, they want to go to grad school, or maybe they decide they don't want to. Like I think it's equally valuable, regardless of the outcome, to figure that out, before you go and spend the next 5 years, of your life doing graduate research, to know what you want to do. But I feel like I've learned a lot from the students that I've personally worked with, and then just more of like working with the whole cohort too, and seeing it grow, the program grow over time. So when I was a summer student, like back in 2007, there was 2 students, like including myself, that were in like biomedical engineering, and our program cohort this past year was 31 REU students. And so, I mean, we've grown exponentially. And with that growth has come like an enhancement of the diversity, and in so many ways, like, geographic diversity, like we recruit students and host them from all over the country. Race and ethnicity, the cohort is much more diverse than it used to be. And we, males and females participate. But also like sort of the types of programs that students come in from. We do have a sort of focus on hosting students, at least a subset of students from colleges that don't have a lot of STEM research opportunities, like community colleges or smaller liberal arts schools that don't have big PhD engineering programs. And, I think that's been great, like in that it enhances the, different perspectives and like, different skill sets that students bring in. But it also is challenging to sort of meet students where they're at, because someone that comes in with like an engineering background that's done, had all basic engineering courses, versus someone from a smaller school that is more of a biology or health and exercise science background. Like the skill sets are very different, and it's not to say that like one's better than the other, but you need to like make sure that you sort of meet the students where they're at, and like that they are not thrown into something that they can't, that they don't really have the training for, and that you also capitalize on their strengths and stuff. And so I think that we've gotten better at that. We've implemented individual development plans and provided more training for the mentors on sort of how to, set expectations at the start of the summer and have those conversations with students. And I think the program as a whole has gotten better because of that, because we've sort of grown and matured and changed over time.
Do you have any tips for like, whether students who are in those programs or people that are, directing programs like this? I'm interested in one, like how you're building community, how you, some strategies that you have found that are useful for meeting students. I guess you just noted like the mentoring piece. Just like from your experience.
Yeah. One of the things that we implemented for the first time last year was a boot camp at the beginning of the summer. And that I think was like a good change. Some of the feedback, I mean, we survey the students every year, and like we do change and adapt the program based off that feedback to try to make it better every year. But one of the things that like we kept hearing was, the students got a lot of like focal research training and like their project in their area, but they were interested to like learn more about like all the other projects, and like, some, like if they were doing imaging research, they wanted to like know a little bit more about the experimental biomechanics or computational biomechanics research. And so we're doing a boot camp now where it's like a half day, like for 4 days, where we give them like experimental biomechanics module. Like they might do some tours and like get to talk with different researchers that are doing that. And then same for like computational biomechanics and imaging. We also have them rotate through the patient simulation lab at our medical center, where they get to work with like the mannequins and stuff. And I think that that's been a good change, in that it's not that anybody comes away like an expert in any of those things, but at least exposes them to what the different opportunities are. And then if their interest is sparked in a particular area, they at least sort of know who to go and talk to and connect with more over the course of the summer while they're here for 10 weeks, to learn more, even if it's not the project that they're working on for their 10 weeks for their research experience.
Well, that's awesome, because research, I feel like definitely as an undergrad, I was intimidated by and had no idea. You just don't know what you don't know. And so that exposure is so key to just get to experience all those different things, and also do that together in a community where there's other people that are, also new and excited about it.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah. We do try to do quite a few social events, and we partner a lot with other summer programs here at our institution. Like we did an ice cream social last year that was probably 100+ people, because we partnered with like 4 or 5 different.
Lots of ice cream.
Lots of ice cream. Yeah. Yeah, and we do a baseball game every year. Like we just buy a bunch of tickets to the local baseball team in Winston-Salem, and we do usually do that with the other summer programs too. And people could bring their families, and their significant others and stuff. And so it's fun just to sort of like socialize outside of the work setting.
That's so funny, because I remember all of these. And it's funny the things that you end up remembering. Like I remember the community. I remember the baseball game. I think I still have this like random token that had just like a dumb joke on it that I got with the beer from the baseball game, which I don't know why. I just like to keep some random things that remind me. And awesome. Like it's funny to go back in the photos of that. And because it was undergraduate students from all over too, it like made it so special that like we all lived in the same housing area, and then we would all kind of go into different areas for our research, but then we were learning from each other and all had different interests in where we wanted to go next, whether that was grad school or industry or medical school. And I've seen so many of people that were in that cohort at conferences or just randomly visiting and knowing that we're in the same town and seeing each other again. So it's like those connections. So I remember the baseball game. I remember this food truck that would come, and we would get peanut butter and jelly burgers from the there was a lot of good food trucks in Winston-Salem that would come to Wake Forest.
Yeah, there's
good advertising right there.
Yeah. There's one now that does lobster rolls outside of our
building. Might need to come back for a graduate student, are you?
Lobster rolls out of a truck.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's really, really good advice. I'm also curious about the training for mentors, and I'm curious what that kind of looks like. I think it's one thing for us to have these experiences and learn from them and implementing feedback, but then teaching other people then how to be a good mentor. You're like mentoring the mentors on that. What does that sort of look like? What kind of training do they have, and what would you say is like the biggest piece of advice that you'd try to share with mentors?
Yeah, so the training that we've implemented last year was taught by an educator at the Winston-Salem State University, which is an HBCU in town. And so it was focused on culturally inclusive mentoring. And so we talked about sort of different backgrounds, that these students come in with, and, how their upbringing and stuff, like, may be different from one to the other, and like having conversations with students about those things. A lot of it's kind of centered around like setting expectations and just sort of having open conversations up front, and not assuming, that someone knows something, or, because a student that's done research before, like, has some experience with the way things work, but like someone that's new at it and, doesn't have a lot of that exposure to that, their institution, it's tough to know what they know, what they know and what they don't know. And so it was more focused on like culturally inclusive mentoring. And I think we'll probably do another one. Like we met with our advisory board earlier this week, and talked about like doing another training like that, and also doing one for the graduate students that like mentor the undergraduate students. And so I think we'll implement something like that this year, where we'll train the faculty mentors, but the graduate students that, like Melissa, you probably worked with some grad students too, like when you were here, but the grad students kind of mentor the undergrads a lot on the day-to-day basis, and so we want to make sure that they're trained too.
Yeah, that's so helpful. I think even for us as graduate students, I don't know that we've ever had
formal mentoring,
training on how to be a mentor. So it seems like it's also a great experience for the graduate students to have something formal like that over the summer to learn how to be a mentor and work with undergraduate students. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to forget what it was like, to not know anything. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think that type of training is like really translatable skill too. Like, if you're going and you're getting a PhD, like you're probably going to be in a job where you're going to be managing and, kind of a team of people. Definitely if you go into academia, you're going to need to do that to manage a lab. But even in industry, like, if you have a higher level degree of PhD or a master's degree, like at some point you're probably going to be managing other people, and so it's good to pick up those skills because that's the kind of thing they don't always teach you in school.
Yeah.
Right.
They
And
don't.
it's been a lot of like, oh, you learn from experience, and it's like, well, there actually are skills and things you can learn to make it better, and it doesn't necessarily just have to come from just starting from a blank slate and learning from experience. There are things that you can learn, and I like your point that it can be translated to not just mentoring undergraduate students, but managing any people in your life and building those relationships. So
yeah.
Well, I think we could talk about all these different topics forever, but we're nearing the end of our time, so I think we're gonna try to do our last few questions here. Two we always love to ask, and the first I'll ask is, can you tell us about a time where you failed or felt like you failed and what you learned from it, what opportunities came from it?
Yeah. So I would say that like the kind of our overarching theme of failure that I still struggle with is just not prioritizing my health and my wellness enough at like the expense of my work. I'll tell you one example. Like as a graduate student, I developed this condition called thoracic outlet syndrome that was causing all this pain down in my hands. Like every time I would work on the computer, and I do computational research, so
oh no,
this was a big problem. And finally, we like through various doctor visits and stuff figured out that I had cervical ribs, which is like an extra rib above my first rib, so like coming off C7 in my neck.
Whoa.
And that was compressing on my brachial plexus, which was sending like nerve pain down in my hands. And I went and like I saw a vascular surgeon. He was like, well, you could have surgery on this, or you could try physical therapy for longer. I mean, I'd been doing physical therapy for like a couple of years, and before I finally went to the surgeon, and he was like, you could have this surgery. And there's this physician up at Johns Hopkins that does hundreds of these years, and she's the expert in it. But the surgery comes with a 3-month like recovery period. And to me, like that just seemed like a lifetime when I was a grad student. I was like, there's no way that I can take 3 months off. And so I like pushed through the pain and just delayed it. And I made myself like miserable. I mean, I would be in tears, like leaving work because I was in so much pain every day. And so eventually I did like go see the surgeon. Her name was Julie Freshlag, and she was up at Hopkins at the time. And she took like one look at me, like I came in the exam room and she was like, you need surgery. Like she could see some kind of
she's like I'm taking you in the back.
Yeah, she could see like the pulsing veins or something in my neck that
my gosh.
but it was just this like flood of relief because I waited for so long, and like I was kind of scared that she was gonna say like I wasn't a candidate, and then I was like I really lost all hope. But I wish that I had prioritized my health earlier for that, because I put myself through a lot of like misery and pain and sort of just delayed the inevitable. And it was not a big deal. I had to take some time off like to recover, but like the world kept turning and it was fine. But the real irony in all of it is that she about 5 years later after I had the surgery, she came and is now CEO of our hospital system here at Wake Forest. So I got to know her, as a patient, but she's, a fantastic surgeon, but also a fantastic organizational leader of our hospital system. But so that's my big fail. But despite going through all that, I still struggle with trying to, balance life and work and keep all the balls in the air.
Yeah, I could imagine that is going to resonate with a lot of people.
Yep.
I know it definitely resonates with me. And I think it's, this idea of also trying to put it off until you can't put it off any longer. And it's like, why do I wait until this, until I'm literally can't go any further? Do you have any advice or things that have worked for you? I know sometimes it's easier to give advice and take your own advice, but I'm curious what your advice would be to people who face similar challenges in balancing and their health and prioritizing that.
Yeah, I'm getting better at delegating. I think that's the big thing, is just trying to take stuff off your plate and give other people the opportunity to help you with it. And I think a lot of, but it's tough to sort of relinquish that control and really bestow responsibility on that other person. But that's the only way that I can do everything that I'm doing, is to rely on my team of people that help me. I try to exercise pretty regularly and eat well, and sleep is a big thing.
We do.
Yep.
We have to
we
sleep.
know that. It's usually the first to go, though.
It is.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I don't know. If you're well rested, I feel like you're able to take on the world a little bit. All the stresses and stuff are a little bit easier to cope with.
For sure.
Definitely.
For sure. Well, thanks for sharing. Yeah. Those tips. And I was gonna say, I feel like we did a whole series on wellness, and still sometimes I'm struggling to maintain.
Yeah, it's tough. I don't know. I'm kind of a perfectionist and an achiever personality, and it's really hard for me to let things go that, especially if I feel like I'm letting other people down, that someone needs something from me at work, a student needs me to do something, I don't want to tell them no, even.
Yeah, that's such an important point too. I can relate. So we've talked about so many amazing projects that you're working on. It was really exciting and inspiring for us. We're curious, I guess before we ask our last question, actually, first, if people wanted to learn more about you and your work, what is the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Ashely A. Weaver. I'm also on LinkedIn. I am trying to get better at posting some of our success stories and stuff on Twitter, successes of my students especially, but putting some of our publications and stuff out there as they get out there. So those are probably the two best social media places to follow me. And then I go to a fair number of conferences. I go to this NASA one, the HRP meeting, and Ohio State University Injury Biomechanics Symposium, and ASBMR, which is a bone and muscle meeting, BMES, which you guys probably know about BMES, and then AAAM is an automotive one. And so you can, see some of my work and work of my students at those conferences too.
Very cool. We love conferences. I miss them. I miss in-person conferences so much. I can't even describe.
Yeah.
Me too.
We'll be back someday.
Yes,
someday.
Yes. Well, as I was saying, your work has been really inspiring through the whole episode, and we're curious with our final question about what you're most excited about for the future of biomechanics.
Yeah, I'm really excited about just the potential to sort of personalize biomechanics more. So I'm interested in, taking medical imaging and making models more biofidelic and more personalized to be able to predict injury and different conditions in people. And I'm pretty excited about the AI and machine learning that's coming out. I think that'll make it more feasible and more efficient to sort of analyze medical imaging and like do that personalization. So that's probably the area that I'm most excited about.
I mean, that is gonna be huge, and it's really a fun time to be in biomechanics because I think we're converging between so many different fields and the advancements that have been made in so many different fields.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you, and thank you for sharing your exciting and impactful work. You're having, such a broad and great reach in so many areas, and it's been so fun to hear your stories and just get to meet you.
Yeah, it was nice to meet you or talk with you all too.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to see you. We really appreciate it.
Biomechanics off our minds.